Hawkins and other Hollywood actors wading onto Normandy Beach and with bagpipers and bulldogs and so on, it reduces me to tears, because these were the people who liberated us, or at least my parents' generation. And in a way, I wrote the book because of that, because we're now living in a period when everything that Churchill and Roosevelt fought for seems to be collapsing, and both the British and the American governments are doing their best to go against many of the ideals that they cherished. So my tears are part of a sort of nostalgia, really, and nostalgia has great pitfalls in history, and the moments of greatest glory can have the kernel of future problems. And that's really what the book is about. And the two things that run through the book, I think, as a kind of as a double refrain, on the one hand, the image of Churchill himself and his long shadow after the war, which has not been an entirely positive one, which is not Churchill's fault, really. But Churchill was indisputably a great war leader, perhaps not the greatest model to follow as a peacetime leader. And I think many mistakes have been made because too many presidents and prime ministers have flattered one another, sort of comparing themselves and their counterparts to Churchill, when it really wasn't called for. Great war leaders have very specific qualities, and Churchill had them. He was the right man to have, perhaps the only man, in 1940. But I think too many American presidents fancied themselves as Winston Churchills, wanted to be great war leaders and using American force to spread freedom and democracy in the world, and often with terrible consequences. The other refrain that I think goes through the book is very much linked to the image of Churchill, and that's of Chamberlain. And I found in doing research, I sort of knew this, but in doing this research for the book, it struck me that every time there was a foreign crisis and the question arose whether the United States in particular, and usually with Britain as its junior partner, ought to intervene with military force or not, Munich 1938 and Chamberlain came up like a sort of ghost haunting them. And just as too many presidents wanted to be Winston Churchill, they were all terrified of being Chamberlain. And this was true in Suez when Eden brought it up. It was true in Vietnam, in Korea, and it was true in Iraq. When Tony Blair sat in his the Prime Minister's country house, reading Chamberlain's diaries and feeling strengthened in his resolve to stand shoulder to shoulder with George W. Bush and invading Iraq, because he felt that Chamberlain had made a big mistake that he would not repeat. Now, this seems to be a very jaundiced view of the Anglo-American relationship, and obviously I don't think it was all a disaster. There were many good things, and in a way that the high point for me was perhaps in 1941, when Churchill and Roosevelt met on their various battleships in the bay in Newfoundland and drew up the Atlantic Charter, which was a great blueprint for the post-war world that my generation was lucky enough to come of age in and grow up in. And that was a charter for a world that was internationalist, that was based on international cooperation, on openness, on freedom, and on independence. Now, Churchill and Roosevelt had rather different ideas on who should have the right to be independent. Churchill certainly did not include the Indians and other colonial subjects, whereas Roosevelt was rather keen, or was less keen on the British Empire and rather keen to dismantle it, but they decided not to quarrel about that for the sake of the wartime, or the future wartime alliance. But we now live in an age, and I'll conclude with that, the President of the United States, whatever else you may think of him, but is very much, has gone back to an attitude to the world that Roosevelt did his best to struggle against. And the America First slogan was Roosevelt hated most and had great trouble in contesting in order to help the British and the Allies in their fight against Germany and Japan. And Boris Johnson and his attitude to Europe is not, I would argue, what Churchill would have done. Churchill was one of the very first in 1946, I believe, in a speech in Zurich, arguing for European unification. The role of Britain was, of course, not so clear, and I think he saw it more as a sympathetic patron than as a full participant. But you can't blame him for that. He was of the generation that won the war. He couldn't possibly see Britain as a European on a par with Germany or France or Italy. I think he probably would have thought differently now. And even Margaret Thatcher was actually a fairly enthusiastic European, despite all her rhetoric. So we're now living in an age that everything that was won by Churchill and Roosevelt is in danger of being lost.
Yeah, I fascinating that your discussion and your topics on the EEC and now the European Union, and we'll certainly get into that in a little bit. If I may ask, through your research, did you find anything that surprised you? And of course, you are speaking to a Churchill focus group, but even throughout other types of part of your research, were there any surprises that you found which you'd like to highlight?
Well, they're always, when you do a book, there are always small surprises. I mean, before I start to write, I usually try and think things through, and you don't really find out, there are no great revelations. But I think the extent to which Munich 1938 haunted post-war leaders surprised me a little bit. I was ended up being more sympathetic to Anthony Eden than I thought I would be. And I also think Churchill's, when he came back to power after the war, which most historians, I think, maybe not present company, but I think the consensus seems to be that that was a mistake. I think he was a little underrated. I think people wrote him off as a senile old has-been a little too quickly, because in some respects he was still pretty sharp. I think he hung on for too long to the expense of poor Eden. But he was not quite the washout that people often make him out to be.
Well, I'd like to now ask Richard and Dane for their thoughts and their reactions to the book. I'll start with you, Dane. From your point of view, what are reactions to Ian's research?
Sure. Well, first of all, this is a wonderfully lucid and engaging history of the so-called special relationship. And I say so-called because I think one of the points that Ian tries to make, and does make very clearly, is that in large measure it's an illusion. It's premised on a misconception that our shared political heritage and or our common ethnic origins, that is, if you buy the racist Anglo-Saxon myth, overrides each country's national interests. And so that's one of the takeaways I took from the book. I should say, just for everyone listening here, that one of the many merits of the book is that it's a really, really good read. It's packed with vivid character sketches of American presidents and British prime ministers and other leaders. But above all, I admire the book because I think it demonstrates so convincingly that the special relationship has always meant more to Britain than it has to the United States, and that it's always meant more to Britain than the United States because Britain was in a position of weakness after the Second World War, having lost much of its empire, and that empire increasingly diminishing as the decades passed. It saw the notion of the special relationship with the United States as a way of maintaining its continued importance in world affairs. And I think that's really an important point that really gets made very clearly in the book. Now, there's one aspect of the subject, or more particularly, I suppose, the title, the Churchill Complex, that Ian alludes to, but I would love to have seen him develop further. And that is, and this gets to really our session today, which is about the current relationship. And that is the way in which Winston Churchill has been appropriated by the political right in the United States in recent decades. They've made him a kind of mascot and a model for their own aspirations to a degree that's really, I think, quite striking. This is evident in the symbolism of Churchill's bust in the Oval Office during the presidencies of George W. Bush and Donald Trump. And I just cite one of many recent examples in which there's been an effort to evoke the memory of Churchill for political purposes. After the photo op that took place when protesters were cleared from the front of the White House so that Trump could stand on the steps of St. John's Church and Lafayette Park, the White House press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, compared Trump to Churchill visiting the destruction that had been wrought by the Blitz in London. And there's this quote, "Like Churchill, we saw Trump inspecting the bomb damage, and that sent a powerful message." Now, I should say it's also worth noting at the same time that the Churchill statue in Parliament Square has been the target of criticism and vandalism by the left in Britain, who have politicized his memory in a very different way. But this raises, I think, the question of what this cultural appropriation of Churchill is all about, and for the very different political agendas, and what consequence this has or will have for the special relationship itself. So those are my remarks.
Thank you, Dane. Those are incredibly thought-provoking. Well, and of course, the title of this talk is the current state of the special relationship, which we will certainly get into as we discuss further. Richard, what are your thoughts on Ian's book? And if you have any thoughts or comments in response to Dane, please feel free to share.
Yeah, thanks very much, Justin. And first of all, can I say thank you to you for organising this wonderful event, and congratulations too on your appointment as the director of the National Churchill Centre. So I think it's a wonderful project, and looking forward to seeing everything that you're going to do with it. And congratulations as well to Ian. He's a colleague of mine at Bard College, a wonderful colleague. And this is a kind of a characteristically terrific book. It's written with all the brio that you would expect of Ian, and all the rigor of scholarship and research, as well as that wonderful writing style. So I had the great privilege of reading some bits of it in draft, and really enjoyed reading the final copy. I think that just kind of onto some of the comments that have been made, if I think about the special relationship, first of all, I don't particularly like that term to describe the Anglo-American relationship itself. I think that in many ways it's unhelpful. And I think that I would say that, I mean, Ian said that everything is collapsing. Dane said that this is all an illusion. I think I would offer as a corrective to that a couple of things that, or suggest a corrective to that. First of all, very often the relationship is seen in the context of the two individuals, the two heads of state, the president and the prime minister. And I think that whatever anybody may think about particular policies, it's fairly clear that there is a genuine personal relationship between President Trump and the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. They seem to have a kind of personal rapport. And we know historically that kind of thing can be useful, because it means, to put it at its crudest level, that you can always pick up the phone, you know that your phone call is going to be taken, and so on. And that historically, that has always been important. But I think I would also step back from that and say that it's not just that relationship which is important. And this is where maybe I would take some disagreement with the kind of the comments that have been made so far, because there are those things that David Reynolds, my PhD advisor many years ago, used to call the touchstones of the Anglo-American relationship. Consultation, first of all. That doesn't mean that Britain and America always agree, But there's always been this tradition of consultation on important decisions. And actually, when things have gone wrong, the things that Ian has mentioned earlier, Munich, the Suez crisis, that's actually occurred when there hasn't been consultation. Second, there's the intelligence relationship, which is still very much alive and well. Five Eyes, the relationship between the NSA and GCHQ, between the CIA and MI6, these are still things which are of crucial importance, not just on obvious things like terrorism, but generally on making sure that kind of around the world, the interests of what we still call the West are protected, looked after. And you only have to look at the recent debate over Huawei and the 5G network to see how important that can be in policy making terms. And then, thirdly, I think, again, historically, we sometimes forget that this has always been a difficult relationship, that going right back to Churchill and Roosevelt, as Ian hinted, I mean, Roosevelt talked about picking the eyes out of the British Empire. There's always been that idea of competitive cooperation. That's one of the reasons why when I wrote my book on Reagan and Thatcher, I called it the difficult relationship, because I was trying to underline the sense in which these two figures, who were very closely aligned, nevertheless had the most the strongest possible disagreements over policy, and would speak to each other in terms that really you could only speak to a very, very close ally. So I think that the special relationship, as it's sometimes called, the Anglo-American relationship, as I would prefer to call it, is something which still has for many decades now has been counted out, but actually keeps bouncing up time and time again. And I would say for those particular reasons of intelligence and consultation, and of course defense, the nuclear, Britain's nuclear system, which is given this special relationship on nuclear weapons that it has because of the United States. For all of those reasons, it's something that is still very important in the world.
Well, I appreciate your optimism, and it's good to have that mixed in this conversation. I will say, Ian's book is sprinkled with these wonderful, very detailed accounts of what you just described. I mean, what came to mind was the story he tells about Jim Callahan going over to President Carter's hut in Guadeloupe, and that's where they decide about the nuclear triad. And so, Ian's book really pulls these out to light. And, in your defense, it certainly describes that sense of continued cooperation with security and defense. Ian, if I may go back to you, any responses on what you just heard from Dane or Richard? Would you agree with Dane's sentiment that the relationship has always meant more to Great Britain?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and for obvious reasons. But I mean, even thinking of the consultation, it's true that with some presidents and prime ministers, there was quite a lot of that. But sometimes when the two sides seemed closest, there was still not all that much consultation when it was really important. For example, Tony Blair was almost slavishly loyal to George W. Bush at the time of the invasion of Iraq. But when it actually came to the invasion, I believe Blair heard about it on the evening news. So the Americans have never thought it was all that important to keep the British informed of everything they did. They did it when it suited them. And between the current prime minister and the president, I'm not quite sure what they would be consulting about. I can't imagine Boris Johnson benefiting greatly from what's his name? President Trump's views on Brexit or how to deal with other European governments and so on. And if he did get his views, I don't think they'd be very useful. And what Trump would consult Johnson about as far as Trump's foreign policy is concerned, I have no idea. So I think one can overstate this. As far as what Professor Kennedy was saying, one thought occurred to me when you talked about the bust in the Oval Office and so on. I mean, one high point or low point, in my view, of the sort of symbolic special relationship was when the British historian Andrew Roberts, who wrote a fawning biography of Churchill, was invited to come to the White House to talk to, I think, Dick Cheney, and possibly even the president did a drop-by or something. And the gist of the conversation was really Roberts in his very sort of romantic fashion telling the Americans to carry the white man's burden, which was a completely traditional, though in this case largely ineffectual and symbolic gesture.
Well, I certainly understand the sense of, and I think we all do understand the sense of the unevenness of the relationship. I mean, from a macro level, and you touch on it in your first or second chapter is, the empire is waning, the British influence, not just in Europe, but also around the world, is waning, while you have this ascendant America. So yeah, I mean, I would agree with Richard's statement that the relationship has always been tough and it's always been uneven. And if I may ask, Ian, you talked at the first part of this discussion, you discussed the Dunkirk and Munich, I would call them ghosts that are invoked often, and throughout your book you refer, and I was kind of counting as you were writing them how often they are invoked by both politicians on both sides of the Atlantic. Can you discuss a little bit more as to what is the power and what is the point of invoking those two historical times?
Well, I think partly because of Churchill, and Churchill was, of course, his own best myth maker. I mean, he was fantastic at what a friend of mine calls legend management, and he did this quite openly. And so the story of 1940 or 1938 up until 1940 is very much of Chamberlain as the sort of villain of the piece, even though Churchill was very courteous to Chamberlain, in fact. But Chamberlain had behaved shamefully, and appeasement, which had never been a word that was particularly negative before, became a sort of the ultimate sin. And the great hero was Churchill, which he was in 1940. There's no question. I mean, in 1940, you needed a bloody-minded, theatrical, romantic leader who could boost the morale when things were very bad. And you did not want a conventional politician who was looking for compromises and to negotiate his way out and so on. I mean, so Churchill was absolutely the right man. But this idea of Chamberlain the villain and Churchill the hero is now sort of set in stone, and people forget that Chamberlain, it was not completely indefensible what he did. I mean, he realized there was neither the will nor the preparedness to fight a war against Germany. He was playing for time. It made a certain sense. It was probably wrong in retrospect, but I think it scared post-war politicians to the core that they would ever be seen as appeasers, even when there were ways of negotiating their way out of problems, and it wasn't wise to go to war. And so in that sense, I think it's had a negative consequence.
I'd like to switch gears and discuss, and Dane, I'll ask you this, the role of American aversion to the British Empire and their colonial possessions, and what they thought they could happen after the war, but what was in reality not happening. Dane, could you discuss a little bit of that aversion from the American side to not engage in any sort of imperialistic endeavors?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, on one level, it's rooted in our own founding as a nation, which comes about in a revolution against the British Empire, right? And I think that awareness was something that informed the views of FDR, who was quite a critic of the British Empire and quite determined to see it recede. I should add that there also was a more self-interested reason for Americans to push for the British Empire to be dismantled after the Second World War, and that is so long as the British held control of colonies, those colonies were in large measure closed to US economic interests. And so as the United States becomes the international economic juggernaut of the post-World War II world, this is a constraint that many American policymakers would like to see brought to an end. But having said all that, what becomes clear is that it only takes a couple of years after the end of the Second World War for American policymakers to begin to modify their position. And they do so in large measure because they increasingly become fearful that decolonization, granting independence to these colonies, will lead to the spread of communism. And as the Cold War takes hold and as it becomes the central preoccupation of American policymakers, the prospect of Britain, which is of course one of its great allies in the struggle, retreating from its empire now looks to be strategically a bad idea.
Especially during the Vietnam War, when Johnson was desperate for the British to hang on to what they still had.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So.
Well, I know you know, Ian, your book covers decades of the special relationship. And again, I encourage all those who haven't yet read it to do so. Moving more towards the present, Richard, you of course wrote on Thatcher and Reagan, and you touched on it a little bit, but tell us, the question I want to ask is, did the relationship rebound under Thatcher and Reagan? Or what type of relationship was it?
Yeah, I mean, that's it. A rebound might be a word, because during the 60s, well, the late 60s and the 70s, there had been some difficulties. Actually, Margaret Thatcher's relationship with Jimmy Carter was not as bad as perhaps we think when we look back. There was actually quite a number of issues where they worked together. But in essence, the reason that the Reagan and Thatcher relationship worked was for this reason that I said before, that she was always supportive in public. And the price of that was she could say whatever she wanted. She was always supportive in public. She could always say whatever she wanted in private. And if you read some of the transcripts of their conversations, I mean, for example, after the Reykjavik summit, I mean, she almost literally tears a strip off Reagan, says things to him that it's almost impossible to imagine a British Prime Minister saying to a president. And certainly she discovered when the first President Bush took over from Reagan that she couldn't speak to him in the same kind of way, and their relationship suffered because of that. But I think that, you know, again, it's these kind of issues that kind of are all the way through the relationship. And Ian says that, well, why would Donald Trump, for example, be speaking to Boris Johnson? Well, whatever the relationship was like, it's because Britain is still the fourth or fifth largest economy in the world. It still has a seat on the United Nations Security Council. It still is one of possibly the leading member of NATO. You know, for all of these reasons, Britain still has an influence in the world. It's not the world's number one power as the United States is, but it's still a power which is able to exert a certain influence especially in particular regions of the world, so that when the United States needs to do things, it helps if it's able to enlist the United Kingdom to shoulder some of the burden. And sometimes that burden is military, but at other times it's to do with prestige and so on. So, you know, I think that we just need to be very careful not to fall into this false binary of it either being the most special relationship, which in many ways is meaningless, or that the whole thing is kind of is falling apart and that it's meaningless. That actually the reality has always been of a much more complex, realist relationship between the two powers who work together when they can, and when they consult, even if they are going in different directions, it means they're able to carry on with these other important touchstones, intelligence and defense.
Richard, if I may ask a follow-up to that, Ian, in his book, he discusses Ted Heath, and he says, well, Ted Heath wanted to change the moniker from a special relationship to a natural relationship. Is that more appropriate, or is that just another just another name that can be given to the relationship?
Yeah, and I think that in some ways, I'm not even sure why we bother worrying about these kinds of titles, that it's the Anglo-American relationship, that's the end of it. I do think that obviously what Heath was trying to do, because he was recalibrating British foreign policy, so it was looking more towards Europe, he wanted to get away from this notion of the so-called special relationship. So I think that's one of the things that he was doing. But, you know, it kind of in some ways, kind of obviously we're now living through this kind of period of Brexit. And what a lot of historians, Roy Jenkins actually makes this point, that one of the problems is with that relationship with Europe that started with Edward Heath, was that he never did the kind of things that Churchill did with the Anglo-American relationships, to actually talk about the shared culture, the shared history, the kind of the sense of togetherness of a wider project. That was always cast in strictly economic terms. Britain wasn't joining a great European project. It was joining the so-called common market. And so I think by not using some of those methods that Churchill used so skillfully in kind of creating this sense of shared destiny, ultimately that's one of the reasons why the British people never really felt as invested in that European project as they did with the Anglo-American one.
So moving towards present day, Ian, the Middle East has played a role in the Anglo-American relationship for decades. You think of the Suez Crisis, you think of the war in Iraq, and you think of course, the Arab Spring. How do you see it playing today, and what do you think? What role did it play, and does it play now?
God, I'm not sure I can answer that question glibly, which is what one has to do in a short panel discussion like this.
Of course.
What role does it play now? I'll take the privilege of having been the author of this book to allow myself to ponder this while Richard or Dana grapple with the question.
Dane, would you like to?
I share Ian's reservation, but let me give a stab at it. I mean, in some sense, this goes back to the question you asked me before about the U.S. in relation to the British Empire. I mean, much of the Middle East was part of the British Empire, and part of the transition by which the British receded from power there was the United States assuming greater control and influence in that region. Now, complicating all of that, of course, is Palestine, i.e. Israel, which makes that policy extremely complicated, messy. The other aspect of it that's important, of course, is oil. But from the perspective of the United States, and maybe Richard has a better sense of this than I do, my impression is that the Americans are there to manage and control oil, not so much to grab it, as Donald Trump would like to do in Iraq, but rather to ensure that the other industrial states have secure oil supplies, and that the world economy continues to function as it needs to function to sustain American economic power. So all of those are important dimensions of that story. Now, today, clearly one of the things that's interesting, it seems to me, is that American influence in the region is in fact diminishing. And that's a subject that perhaps can be discussed in greater detail at some other point.
Thank you. Richard, any comments?
Not particularly, only
Yeah.
to say that the Middle East is interesting in terms of the Anglo-American relationship, because exactly as Dane says, this is an area that Britain was the dominant power. The United States increasingly becomes the dominant power, so that a lot of the differences and disagreements between Britain and America, for example, during the Suez Crisis, most famously, do occur in this region. I mean, it's interesting. I will be fascinated to see, once the documents come out about the kind of current peace deals between Israel, for example, and the United Arab Emirates, whether Britain did play any role at all in facilitating these, because the UAE is a country where Britain still does have an influence. So it will be interesting to see whether British diplomats and so on were used for any kind of back channel reasons. So, I think it's a complex one, and it captures that kind of competitive cooperation that has always been so important in the relationship.
In a way, I think probably Britain's interests in the Middle East, such as they are now closer to the European interests in the Middle East than they are to the American ones, and that partly for domestic political reasons. But no European country has the same domestic pressures that any administration in Washington is going to be under when it comes to Israel. And that doesn't really touch politics in Britain. It doesn't touch politics in the rest of Europe. So Britain is really with Europe on this, even though it's not formally part of the EU anymore.
Well, I'll move on to Brexit. Can you, Ian, discuss or ruminate on what were the initial consequences to the relationship when Brexit was first decided, and then what do you think the long-term consequences are?
As far as the relationship is concerned, or,
yes,
or
yeah,
the consequences of Brexit?
To the Anglo-American relationship specifically.
Well, this is an area where Richard and I disagree. My view is that in the beginning, well, both Obama and Trump got involved in this rather foolishly, I think. Obama thought, but it wasn't quite Obama's fault. President Obama was more or less asked by David Cameron's Conservative government to come in and help. And it was apparently, he was asked by the Foreign Office to make a statement and say that Britain should definitely stay in the EU and so on. And I don't think that was a wise move, because people don't like foreign leaders interfering in that way, and it was probably counterproductive. Donald Trump also has made various statements on Brexit and Mr. Brexit this and so on and so forth, none of which are very helpful. But I think what is much more important is what the future might be. And I'm a pessimist in this respect. And I think that whoever is in power in the United States is going to take most seriously countries that are of interest to the United States. And the EU, with its vast economic power, is going to be of far greater interest to the United States than Britain cast adrift, and I agree with Richard, you can't dismiss Britain. It's still an important country. It has a big economy and so on and so forth. But Britain alone in foreign policy is far less important than even Germany alone, but let alone Germany in the EU and the EU in general. So I think Britain will become more and more provincial, less and less important. And the Americans, who are already, I mean, decades ago, usually took the German chancellor, rhetoric aside about Milton and shared values and Shakespeare and all that, took the German chancellors more seriously often than they took British prime ministers, because that's where the clout was. And that's going to be even more true from now on.
Richard, Ian says you two disagree. Would you like to disagree right now?
Yeah, I'm not sure where we disagree. Maybe I'm a bit more optimistic than he is, but maybe that's a temperamental thing. I don't know. I think that, I mean, on one level, I think he's absolutely right that the intervention of Barack Obama, as it turns out, probably was not helpful, because one of the things that came out of that Brexit campaign, for me, seeing it from the United States, not actually in Britain itself, was that a lot of people did not like the idea of elites, including global elites, telling them what to do. And if you look at, for example, books like White Shift by Eric Kaufman, he makes it very clear that there was a real sense of alienation from those political and metropolitan elites that had a decisive impact. So I don't think it was helpful to have the US president coming in and saying, you know, if you do this, you're going to end up at the back of the, and of course he didn't say line, he said queue, you'll be at the back of the queue, which led to questions about whether he'd been briefed or not. I mean, in terms of the broader strategic question, you know, I think to use that old cliche, was it, I can't remember who it was it Mao who said about the French Revolution that it's too early to tell? That kind of with Brexit, I think it still is too early to tell. I do actually think that the coming election is going to be very consequential for Britain and the Brexit process, because clearly a trade deal with the United States is going to be very important. And just with all the noises coming out, it seems more likely that would be possible with a second Trump administration than it would with a Biden administration. But that having been said, I still think that is a good example of the kind of thing that I was talking about before, because if President Biden, if Joe Biden becomes President Biden, and a lot of his talk has been about rebuilding international institutions, rebuilding things like NATO, the way in which the United Nations works and so on, he is going to require the United Kingdom to help him do that, just simply through the realities of power. Britain's seat on the UN Council that I mentioned, the Security Council that I mentioned earlier, NATO, and so on. So, you know, I think that there is still a way in which Britain will be able to navigate its way on the world stage. But exactly as Ian says, at the moment, that is very much up in the air. And a lot of it will depend not just on these historic ties, not even on these institutional advantages, nuclear weapons, there's UN and kind of so on, but also on diplomatic skill, on a lightness of touch, being able to somehow find that traditional role that Britain has always played as being a bridge between Europe and the United States.
Yeah, Dane, you know, we've heard from a self-professed pessimist and a self-professed optimist. Any comment, any last comment to what you just heard before I read off some of these wonderful questions that we've received from the audience?
Right. Just briefly, I'm more on the pessimistic side, and part of this has to do with something that neither the other speakers mentioned: Ireland. So long as Ireland becomes a point of contention between, or remains a point of contention between Britain and the EU, that's going to make it very difficult for the special relationship, insofar as there is one, to sustain itself.
Well, that'd be a wonderful topic in and of itself. Maybe we'll have a follow up. So we have.
If I could just add there that, I mean, I think it's a really, really interesting question. I lived in Dublin for 15 years, so including during the kind of the negotiations of Good Friday and so on. And I think that it's one of the things that the Irish have often spoken about is the way in which they were able to engage the Clinton administration and bring the Clinton administration into Irish politics. But the way in which they did it was by also having the British working in the same direction. So I think that it would become a really interesting diplomatic, strategic question for the United States over the question of Ireland, exactly which way it would fall. Because, you know, as I've said before, Britain still has these advantages, still has this strategic role. And so the extent to which Britain would be frozen out over the question of Ireland, I think is an absolutely fascinating one.
Yeah. Well, we've had quite a few questions regarding the current and upcoming, I should say, presidential election. And I'll start with you. So one question from Jonathan Thomas, thank you, Jonathan, is how do you think the special relationship, that is the Anglo-American relationship, will change under a possible Joe Biden administration?
Well, I think some of this has already been answered. On the Irish question, the British won't have an easy interlocutor with Joe Biden because he cares about Ireland and he's not going to do anything that would jeopardize their position. On international institutions, he'll be much more of an internationalist than Donald Trump, which is not hard, which will improve relations with Europe in general and probably with Britain as well. So, but these are my own views. I mean, I think in almost every respect, President Biden will be good for everybody, including the special relationship, but it won't be all that special anymore, if it ever was, it'll become even less special than it has been.
So another question, this is separate from that, is Randy asked us, why do you think Churchill wanted a lasting stickiness with the Americans, never be parted from the Americans? And I will say that it is that quote is also touched on, you know, extensively throughout scholarship of Churchill looking back. And if I may say, and this is a delayed point, but to your point about Andrew Roberts, his biography was certainly favorable of Winston Churchill, but not uncritical. But I know that the stickiness reminds me of that, of his work. But can you talk about that quote, never be parted from the Americans, from Churchill? And I mean, is that outdated, or is that something that should be a fundamental part of the relationship?
Well, whether it's outdated or not depends on what Britain will be like after Brexit, and we don't know. But Churchill certainly thought that way during World War II because he realized it was the only way the Nazis are going to be defeated. After the war, I don't know exactly what Churchill thought. I mean, he was tormented by the relative loss of British power vis-a-vis the United States, even though he had a sentimental attachment to the relationship, but he felt the gradual loss of British influence very deeply. But what he may have thought, and what many British prime ministers have thought since, is that the only way for Britain to continue sitting at the high table, as it were, and play a role in the world that their economy and military power often could barely afford, was to stick very closely to the Americans. And I think that is outdated. I think Britain's interests lie far more in Europe. And so I regard Brexit as a tragedy. And I say that as somebody who loves and admires Britain.
Yeah. A great question from Jack B. He asks, and I'll ask this of Dane, and maybe Richard, you can give your opinion too. He asked, despite the highs and lows of the relationship over the past several decades, do you have any thoughts on the ways that the relationship can be strengthened in the present day and going forward?
Well, I mean, we are at a kind of inflection point, aren't we? And I think that's been indicated both by Richard and Ian in some of their comments. And I just sort of reinforce what they've said there. A lot of this will depend upon the election.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there are two things. That number one, intelligence is only going to become more and more important. I mean, it's one of the things that we've seen in kind of Western elections, the kind of the digital revolution. For all of these reasons, intelligence is going to become something where there'll be more focus, and Five Eyes, I think, is something where the United States and Britain, along with the three other countries, will be incredibly important going forward. And then there is this question of trade that, you know, I remember actually in the last panel that I did at the National Churchill Centre with the British Deputy Ambassador, one of the points that was made during that discussion was that in some ways the worst thing for Britain to do would be to fall between the two stools of the EU or the United States economically. And so if, as now looks likely, Britain is actively looking to push itself into the American economic sphere rather than the European one, well, that's not going to be an uncomplicated thing to do, but it is kind of something that would be very consequential. I should also say that I agree with your point about Andrew Roberts. I think it's a very deeply researched biography and actually quite nuanced in the view that it takes on Churchill, although ultimately it is a biography that is kind of has a positive view of Churchill, but just the sheer depth of research, of archival research that's been done in that book is very impressive.
Go ahead, Ian. Yeah.
On intelligence and trade, yes, there's been a lot of cooperation, but let's not forget it has a checkered history, and the last and most dramatic episode in shared intelligence was trying to find WMD in Iraq, and neither Britain nor America covered themselves in glory on that intelligence story. On trade, I think the problem is that, yes, Britain will have to get a deal with the United States, but it'll do so as very, very much the weaker party. In Europe, it was one of the leading powers in Europe with the clout of the EU, and it negotiated trade deals with the outside world. Now it's going to be a middling European country that more or less has to go to Washington with the begging bowl, and this cannot be a good thing if you feel sympathetic towards Britain.
A very interesting question from John Miller, and I'll put this to the group, and I don't know which one of you is best to answer this, but he asked a very specific but very interesting question about why Churchill decided to send Lord Halifax to Washington to be the ambassador to the United States at the very genesis of the I wouldn't say fragile, but the young special relationship. Would anybody like to speculate on? I mean, I think the pessimist side would say to get Lord Halifax out of the way, and
he wanted to get rid of him.
Is there any other nuanced view than that, than wanting to get rid of him? Because it was an important role, of course, and you know, he was close to you know, at least physically close to FDR. Anyone want to speculate? Okay, so
I think it really was that he wanted to get rid of him. He had his own open line to Roosevelt, yes, and so was able to communicate directly with him. But that having been said, Churchill also recognised that Halifax was a very skilled diplomat, that he was kind of somebody who would represent the United Kingdom well in Washington and so on, and would be particularly good at a lot of the things like throwing parties in the embassy and this kind of thing. But essentially, it was a political decision to
he was probably also
out of the way.
He was probably also the least suitable man to send to Washington, because if Americans who did not like England and upper class English toffs, to them, he would have been the worst example of the sort of hoity-toity, toffee-nosed Englishman who looked down his aquiline nose at everything American.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, he was, and I think of the question, and I like the question because it really makes you think. But I think we'd all agree that it was to get this rather frenemy, if you will, out of the way. So we're just a few minutes from time. I think I'd like to wrap up with all of you are practicing professors, and I'll start with you, Dane. If a student came to you, and I know this is theoretical, so not trying to, this is not a gotcha question or anything, but if a student came to you and said, hey, I'd like to do some research on the Anglo-American Special Relationship, from your individual point of view, where would you tell them that that they should research in? Like, what are some areas that you think the research needs to be done further in?
Oh, that is a gotcha question. I mean, in the sense that I always encourage students to pursue, the particular topic that intrigues them. I think the whole relationship is so problematic in so many ways that I would reframe it for the students, or I'd ask the students to think about it in a more problematized fashion rather than think of it as a special relationship. I'd encourage them to read Ian's book as a starter, and appreciate that it's a much more complex, nuanced relationship, and that might be a way for them to get into a more substantive topic.
Richard, any advice for a would-be young researcher?
Well, first of all, I always like to encourage people to do whatever they want to do. So I would be glad that somebody wanted to work on this topic. I think my advice would be actually the advice that I was given when I was in that position, which is to go to the edge of the archives. That if you want to say something new, the easiest way to do it is to research the material that has just come out into the public domain. And in some ways, actually, that's quite interesting during this coronavirus crisis, that when it's more difficult to get to archives, that actually, because the Thatcher documents are now just coming to the end, a lot of that material has been digitized. It's on the Thatcher Foundation website, which essentially publishes all documents from her administration. So that would be a good place to start. And then thirdly, there is actually a return of interest to almost into fashion of diplomatic history too. So I think that this is kind of something where there is a lot of work that could be done that would be very interesting, and a lot of young, exciting scholars are now starting to return to working in this kind of way. So that's all to the good as far as I'm concerned.
Great. And I appreciate your your thoughts on this as well. We are, as you know, this is hosted by the National Churchill Library and Center, which is at George Washington University, and our mission is to engage students with, of course, Churchill, but history in general, and encourage them in research. Even though, again, self-professed pessimist about the relationship, any advice you'd give to a young researcher who read your book and was inspired to learn more, to do their own?
Yeah, I think one should be careful not to become too exclusively focused on Britain and America, and that in order to understand the relationship historically, you'd also have to really learn a bit about France and Germany and the development of European institutions. And so learn French is one thing. I mean, be exclusively Anglophone and just look at London and Washington is too narrow.
Please go ahead.
If I could add to this, I mean, I think it should be broadened even further, right? I mean, one of the things that was striking about the Obama administration was its Pacific shift, and the way in which that is reoriented America's relationship to Britain and Europe as a whole. Its effort, which obviously has been undermined by the Trump administration, but to try to establish closer ties with various Asian countries across the Pacific is another part of that story that we might often overlook.
Well, I appreciate, gentlemen, all of your time, and Ian, thank you for writing this book, and for the attendees, we greatly appreciate your time as well. Like I said, this is being recorded, so we'll share it later on, and maybe we'll convene 1 year from now, and we'll be able to answer that question: how, if there is a new administration, how has it changed the relationship? So thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Yes.
Take care. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Richard. Thanks, Dane.
Yes, thank you, Ian. Lovely book.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank
well
you,
done,
everyone.
Ian. Congratulations.
Yeah.
Take
Bye-bye.
care, all attendees. Thank you.